Okay, good evening. Tonight we will cover the 12th and final Torah portion of the book of VaYechi, of the book of Genesis. It's called VaYechi. And it picks up the narrative where Jacob is living the final 17 years of his life in Egypt. And it's a period of tranquility for him. And some commentaries even relate it back to the desired moment of tranquility Jacob was seeking when he returned back from Lavan's house in the beginning of Parshat VaYeshev, where the Torah used the word VaYeshev, that he dwelt there with the hope that it would be peaceful because he had gone through so much already in his life. And of course, it was just the beginning of this tumultuous 22-year period of time where he's eventually reunited with his son Yosef, with Joseph. And then he and the entire Jewish people come down to Egypt. So let me do a quick summary of this final Torah portion. So it begins with Yaakov, with Jacob requesting of his son Yosef to be buried back in the land of Canaan and not be buried in the land of Egypt. Many reasons given for this. Okay. One second. Sorry. Okay. But he made the request of Joseph, because he was the one in power. And then as Jacob gets sickly toward the end of his life, he summons Yosef and Ephraim and his two children, Ephraim and Manasseh, and he blesses them with the famous blessing that we convey to our children. And he says this is the way Jewish people should bless their children. Yisimcha Elokim ke'Ephraim u'Manasseh. We bless our children that God should raise them up or should place them alongside Ephraim and Manasseh as paradigms of virtue. And famously in that blessing, Jacob switches his hands, mentions Ephraim ahead of Manasseh, even though Manasseh was the eldest. Joseph tries to correct him and he says, no, this is the way it's going to be. Then very significantly, in the beginning of chapter 49, Yaakov himself, sits up at his bed and calls all of his sons together to surround him. This is a very dramatic moment, chapter 49, page 275 in the Art Scroll, because he says, assemble yourselves and I will tell you what will befall you in the end of days. And then it's sort of a break in the text, in the narrative, and it says, gather yourselves and listen. And by tradition, we have the following idea, that Yaakov wanted to tell the rest of human history prophetically to the Jewish people, so that as we went through life and we went through history, we would have a clear overview of everything that was to take place. And at that moment, God's presence departed from him. He lost the capacity for prophecy, and therefore he regrouped, and he goes on to instead give a distinct and individual blessing to each one of the 12 sons, each one of the 12 tribes. After doing that, it describes how Jacob passes away. He's brought up very ceremoniously to the land of Canaan, and he's buried in the Me'orat Machpelah, in the ancestral tomb, alongside of his wife Leah, and together with his father, near his father Yitzchak and his grandfather Abraham. A little episode there where the brothers panic after Yaakov dies and they plead with Yosef. Yosef tells him everything's going to be fine, that he harbors no ill will in his heart. And then Yosef passes away at the end of this week's Torah reading, very significantly saying to his brothers, God will indeed remember you. And when he does, you will bring my bones back to the land of Canaan and bury me there. And he passes away. And that's the summary of this week's Torah reading. Those are the events and an outline of the Parsha of VaYechi. Unusually, Rashi points us out in the beginning, VaYechi is the only portion in the Torah which begins in the middle of a paragraph. So if I showed you the Torah, the written Torah, you would see that there's no paragraphing between the words VaYechi and the end of last week's Torah reading. And this alludes to a fact. Rashi gives a couple of explanations. Other rabbis and Midrashim give other explanations. But it alludes to the fact that Yaakov's connection to God was somewhat clouded in anticipation of the fact that Yaakov understood that this descent to Egypt was going to be the beginning of the foretold chapter of Jewish history, where the Jewish people would be enslaved and oppressed in Egypt, only to be redeemed at the end of a 400-year period. So therefore, this is what's called a closed parsha. It's closed because to some extent, Yaakov's clarity of vision is not as clear as it could be. And I just want to point out to you that if you look at the life of Jacob, there are many different ways you could divide it up. But an important way would be the level of connection and intimacy he has with God. Because we know from the moment that Joseph was sold into slavery and it was reported back to Yaakov that his son Yosef had died, out of sadness and out of a sense of mourning for this lost son, who he foresaw as being the real leader of the Jewish people, that sense of mourning cut Yaakov off from communication with God. And it's only on the way down to being reunited with him 22 years later that God speaks directly to Yaakov again and renews their intimate, close relationship as a Navi, as a prophet interacting with Hashem. From this, we derive many lessons, one of which is that to have a prophetic vision, a person has to be happy. Eina shchina shora ela mitoch hasimcha. That God's presence is only obvious when a person feels a sense of well-being, a sense of goodness, a sense of satisfaction, a sense of wholeness, and a sense of happiness. And therefore, there's the whole travail of the Jewish people through history in this regard alone is going to be a intensification or a lack of intensification of our connection with Hashem. And hence the imperative that a person needs to strive to be happy. Happy doesn't mean giddy, happy doesn't mean everything is great, but happy means in a significant way, understanding that the moment I'm in is a pivotal moment in Jewish history. And the more happiness and joy and presence of mind and gaze toward the future I can muster, the more intensive my connection with God will be. And that's a very basic idea in Judaism, and I want to point that out as being emphasized here at the end of the book of Bereshit. So this is a closed Torah portion, even though it is, what takes place in it is Jacob, Yaakov, through his blessings, defining roles and a future for the Jewish people. A question I wanted to explore as a theme for tonight's class is the following. What are we doing in Parshat VaYechi? Are we wrapping up the book of Bereshit in a dramatic, conclusive way, tying together all of its loose ends? Or are we, to use a TV term, introducing the next season and setting things up so that, oh, Joseph is dying, he says, Pakod Pakati Eschem, God will surely remember you, and that dark times are coming, but God will eventually take us out and redeem us. We all know this prophecy that was given to Abraham, that Abraham's descendants would descend down to Egypt and would be enslaved and oppressed there for a long period of time, and only then would emerge as the real people of God ready to withstand history. So is this Parsha an interlude to get us ready for the book of Exodus, or is it pulling together and wrapping up the book of Bereshit in a very strong way? And please unmute yourself and offer your opinion if you have one. I would be happy to hear from anybody who's here right now. What do you think? So I want to suggest that often in the past, until now, I have really thought of this book of VaYechi as sort of being just a final chapter in the book of Genesis and setting us up for the book of Shemot and for the enslavement of the Jewish people and for the redemption of Egypt. After all, the redemption of Egypt is the seminal game-changing moment of Jewish history, which we celebrate every year at the Pesach Seder, and it leads 49 days later to standing at Mount Sinai in the revelation at Sinai. So it would seem that those 50 days of Jewish history, including the splitting of the sea, are so pivotal and dramatic moments that at the end of the foundational information of the Jewish people, the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the creation of the nation, we're really setting ourselves up for the events that are going to follow, which is ultimately going to galvanize the Jewish people into the people of God, able to withstand the whole course of history. But I want to suggest some thoughts that are different than that, and to revise my thinking and perhaps your thinking as well. In a simple way, I want to look at the book of Bereshit as being the Jewish people overcoming their internal family challenges from within, to go from being a vision and a belief that Avraham Avinu had together with his wife Sarah and taught to the world, but galvanizing that from internal trials and tribulations, sending away Ishmael, giving blessings to Jacob and not to Esau, the 12 tribes having their issues amongst themselves and sorting out the issue of leadership ultimately for the internal leadership of the Jewish people. And I would rather like to think about Parshat VaYechi as being the successful resolution to all of the internal difficulties of the Jewish people going from a vision of Abraham into a nation. And then book 2 of the Torah, Shemot, beginning with the descent into Egypt and talking about our suffering there and the miraculous immersion from there and those 2 events of the Exodus and the receiving of the revelation at Sinai. But that those external pressures and external travails and challenges to the Jewish people, we're only able to deal with them because of the success of the conclusion of the book of Bereshit, that internally the Jewish people had become strong. And I want to suggest that this Parsha of VaYechi is pulling together all of the different threads that might be hanging to show the inner strength and the capacity of the Jewish people to emerge as a unified whole and therefore ready to undergo the tests and travails and slavery of Egypt, the oppression of Egypt, and therefore able to emerge from that and to have successfully leave Egypt behind and to stand at Mount Sinai and receive the Torah. So it's a nuance of a difference, but I think it's a significant difference, and I want to explain that to you. First and foremost, it's striking to me that the first blessing that takes place here when Yosef brings his 2 sons seems to evoke so many past events in a challenging way. It's time to bless the 2 sons of Yosef, and what Yaakov is doing here, and what he's elevating the 2 sons of Yosef so that they become tribes in their own right. And that's where we have 12 tribes or 13 tribes, depending on how you count them. Jacob had 12 sons, and those are basically the 12 tribes. But oftentimes when we count the tribes, we leave out the tribe of Levi because they were the teachers of the Jewish people. They didn't have a portion in the land of their own. And we insert the 2 sons of Yosef, of Ephraim and Manasseh, as tribes in their own right, and they become the 12 tribes. In doing so, the whole idea that they would be brought in front of Yaakov and they would be stood in a way that his right hand should be placed on the head of Manasseh, the oldest, and his left hand on the head of Ephraim. But then Yaakov crosses over his hands and puts his right hand on the head of Ephraim. The boys themselves don't complain. Joseph is concerned about the switching of the hands. What is going on here? Is it like reopening all these old wounds, or is something else going on here? And I want to suggest from the style of the narrative that there's a very big insight here. And the insight is as follows. The only concern Yosef had when Jacob put his right hand on the head of Ephraim and his left hand on the head of Manasseh was maybe there was an element of confusion, and that blessing, which was meant to go, so to speak, from Yaakov's right hand, and therefore should have gone to Manasseh in front of him. If his hand was placed on the head of Ephraim, it wouldn't be the appropriate channel or blessing for Ephraim because it was going to the wrong child. There's maybe Yaakov got confused, or maybe his hands were crossed out of error. But once it's clear that his hands were not crossed out of error, neither Yaakov nor Yosef nor Ephraim nor Manasseh, who should have had the biggest problem with it, has any problem with it. They're all comfortable with the idea that we want to rely on the patriarch Yaakov's understanding of which blessing, what blessing goes to whom. The blessings here are undifferentiated, but in a certain sense, each hand conveyed its own blessing. And everyone is okay because their sense is that the rightful, correct choice is happening, and Yaakov knows what he's doing, and therefore the appropriate blessing that is suited for Manasseh will go to Manasseh, and the appropriate blessing that should go to Ephraim is going to Ephraim. And the fact that Ephraim is leapfrogged in terms of sequence ahead of Manasseh because he's greater doesn't cause any troubling. This is a tremendous resolution to an issue that plagues all mankind and certainly plagues the Jewish people in terms of leadership. And although a lot of things can be debated in terms of hierarchical societies and hierarchies in general, it should be clear here that there are individuals who are meant to be leaders, and there are other individuals who are meant to have what we'll term a supporting role to the leadership of someone else. And that's sort of a given in the Torah. And it's not meant to create disharmony, but rather it's meant to create organization so that everybody can optimize their own personal growth and connection with Hashem. And so that as a whole, the family, the community, the country, whatever the situation will be, can all be organized properly to maximize the amount of good and the capacity for good that's taking place. And I think we get a taste of that in the blessings being given to Ephraim and Manasseh. The fact that the younger is elevated over the elder, the fact that the right hand crosses over with the left hand, that all those things take place is really meant to evoke for us a sense that judgments have to be made in terms of the rightful place, the rightful positioning, the rightful role of leadership, and where that belongs for the good of everyone. And that's something which people can handle, they can be accepting of. It doesn't have to breed violence where one prince kills the other, or where the king gets assassinated by the one who's on the way out. But in an honest, open, sincere family, and in an honest, open, sincere society, it's accepted and clear that there are going to be leaders who take added responsibility upon their own shoulders, who exercise that leadership for the good of everyone. And that's the way society and individuals together can reach the pinnacle of human achievement. Because this answers another question. When we look at the blessing that Jacob conveys to each of the 12 tribes, 12 sons, he gathers them all together, and then he gives each one an individual blessing. And some blessings are really better than others. Yehuda gets blessed to be the king and the leader and have that role for the Jewish people. And other blessings like Levi and Shimon or blessings of dispersal for reasons because that'll be what's best for them to function within the overall good in society. So a question that's asked by Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky and quoted, I saw in a piece by Rabbi Avi Cohn. Why would you gather together your 12 sons if you're going to give each one a unique differentiating blessing? Why wouldn't you call them in one at a time and give each one the blessing? And the answer to that is because there's benefit in each brother coming to understand the particular strength that his brother has vis-a-vis his own strength, seeing where he fits into a larger picture, and then enabling the family, to become the people, to become the carriers of Hashem's message throughout history. And that's why Yaakov gathers them all together, because there's no sense of playing favorites. There's no sense of picking and choosing. There's only a sense of looking within the depths of the soul of each person, and through a blessing, bringing out and highlighting and strengthening that which needs to be strengthened for the good of the individual and for the good of the collective. And at times to steer away from those areas that are weaker and those areas that are susceptible or vulnerable, and therefore would make the whole family vulnerable, pushing people away from those roles and making it clear to them that that's something for them to avoid throughout history. And I'll give you an example of that. The tribe of Levi is blessed with the responsibility to be the teachers of the Jewish people. Amongst them are the Kohanim, whose job is to minister in the Beit HaMikdash. The Ramban, we finished celebrating Hanukkah a week ago, but the Ramban is very, very clear that the Hashmonaim, once they assumed the kingship of the Jewish people, they were doomed, even though they were the lead fighters, even though they were critically important in throwing off the yoke of the Greek rulers so that the Jewish people could continue practicing Judaism and have a temple. But the minute they named themselves also as kings, they became doomed. And the viability of the Jewish people to carry that forward became doomed as well, to the extent that, unfortunately, the Talmudic rabbis point out that there was no descendant of the Hashmonai. They saved the Jewish people at the time of Hanukkah. They relit the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash, but once they assumed the role of kings inappropriately, they stepped out of their designated role within the Jewish people, and they usurped the role of Yehuda by not giving that responsibility back to the tribe of Yehuda. So then they were doomed, and in fact, by the time that the second temple is destroyed, there is no human being alive who can say, I am a descendant of the Hashmonaim. Very sad outcome, but a very clear message that this idea of giving blessings that are appropriate to each individual, differentiated blessings, and building upon the strengths of each individual and doing it only out of love and kindness and doing it for the good of the whole, that's really, that positions the Jewish people internally to be the strongest we possibly can be. And that's what enabled the Jewish people to now be ready to wrap up the book of Bereshit with strength as a family/nation. And now they're ready to withstand whatever travail and trauma and slavery is imposed upon them, because when you're internally strong, outside difficulties and vicissitudes will never undermine you and never close the door. And that's part of this idea of it being a closed portion, an open portion. It's very clear here from the sequence of events that a hierarchy is being put together, and it's being put together for the good, ultimate good of the Jewish people. And I just want to say the concluding idea, because it's in defense of leadership, and it's an insight that I just learned last week when I saw this source quoted. We have a song for each day of the week, and we say it at the end of Shacharis, at the end of the morning prayers. Shir Shel Yom HaRishon, Shir Shel Yom HaSheni. We go through each one. And if you look in the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah, page 31a, Amud Aleph, there's a brisa there which discusses why they choose each one of those psalms for each one of those days. But here's what's noteworthy. On the first day of creation, we sing La Hashem Ha'aretz Umloa. We take the psalm, which has its hallmark. The earth is the Lord's and its fullness. And the Talmud concludes, because God acquired a world which God then transferred ultimately to mankind to watch over and to guard and to build up. And God ruled over this world. Visholit bi'olamo. God was the ruler over the world. What's the second day? Gadol Hashem u'mehulo ma'od. Great is the Lord and highly to be praised, and God's referred to as a king. Noteworthy is that the second day of creation was when there was a separation that took place. And God separated between the lower waters and the upper waters. He created a firmament in between, the atmosphere, whatever you want to look at it as. And there was a havdalah, there was a division, a divisiveness in the world. There was, to use the terms of tonight's class, a hierarchy that was introduced into the world where certain waters were deemed to be upper waters, certain waters were deemed to be lower waters. So the Talmud says, Hashem shechilek ma'asav, God divided up what was then an undifferentiated world. On the first day, he just introduced light. But on the second day, he divided it up. U'molach aleihim, and God was the king over them. So it's only on the second day, God goes from being the ruler to being the king. And in a very interesting, complex explanation, Pri Tzaddik explains, you only need a king when you have differentiation. And when you need someone to rule over and to understand the differences and how the differences can work closely together for the good of the whole. And that becomes the definition of a melech, of a king. Another way it's put on Rosh Hashanah is Ein Melech B'Olam, when we cry out to God, we are your people and you are our king. Please rule over us and rule over the whole world, which is the essential component of our tefillah, of our prayers on Rosh Hashanah. What we're really saying to God is it's a differentiated world, and even we, the Jewish people, are different. So we need you as the king to make judgments about each one of us and to bring out all that's good within us, to shield us from that which is not so good within us, and to organize humanity and organize the world in such a way that there can be a clear purpose and goal and orchestration and unity achieved in spite of differentiation. And that's when a melech comes in place. And that really defines, just to go back to last week when we did not have a class, and I apologize, where we had the ultimate standoff between Judah and Joseph, Yehuda and Yosef, where we had Yosef in disguise trying to separate Benjamin out from the rest of the people and make him into a slave. And we had Yehuda, who earns thereby the position of kingship over the Jewish people, stepping forward and saying, no, take me as a slave instead of him, because every aspect of the people needs to be together and needs to have its rightful place and needs to recognize its difference from all other parts of the puzzle, its importance in its unique way, and its place within the puzzle to complete the picture and give the Jewish people strength. That's what happens in this week's Torah reading. And we see Yosef at the greatest heights of grandeur, being the leader, the temporary leader of the Jewish people, just like eventually a descendant, Shaul, becomes the temporary king until King David from the tribe of Judah becomes the permanent king. But we need Joseph to be able to look his brothers in the face and say, I harbor no grievance against anyone, because as the leader of the Jewish people at this moment, my only purpose and goal is to sustain us all for the good of each one of us and for the good of all of us. And that's what's triumphant about the end of the book of Bereshit. In the end of the book of Bereshit, we have the 12 tribes living together in peace, not in their rightful land, but in the land of Egypt, in the place where they are soon to become oppressed and despised and rejected. But we have them internally sorted out with a leader and with followers and with harmony and with a lack of tension, with a lack of jealousy, without any sense of conflict from within. And hence the book of Bereshit ends on a high note. And I want to use a final source to explain this. At the end of the Torah, it's on page 1100. It's in the book of, in Chazinu. It is in the book of Devarim. chapter 32, sentence 4. God is described as tzaddik v'yosharhu, that God is always righteous, and some people use the word fair when it comes to Yoshor. The Netziv, the Volozhin Rosh Yeshiva, who passed away in the 1880s, he always referred to the entire book of Genesis as the name Sefer HaYoshor, which is a traditional name for the book of Genesis, the book of straightness. And the Netziv explains that the word Yoshor, straightness, fairness, denotes proper interpersonal conduct and integrity and respect shown to all others, even those who you fundamentally disagree with, and even those whose lifestyle is in opposition to your own. And he uses as the prime example of this, Abraham praying to spare the corrupt city of Sodom, who were the antithesis of his life of kindness and goodness and helping others and sharing others. And he says, that's what the book of Bereshit is meant to tell us. The book of Bereshit is meant to teach us that there's such a thing as yashrut, straightness, fairness, recognizing the good within every single human being, interacting to those strengths, and with the understanding that God created all, and all that God created has a special, important, and unique place within creation. That's the wrap up of the book of Bereshit. A further reference to this is the idea that there's a Medrasha comment that when Jacob gives his blessing to each of the 12 sons, what he was doing was analogous to Adam naming all of the animals in chapter 2 of Genesis. What does that mean? Well, when God finished creation and introduced Adam into the world, God said, I'm going to bring all things in front of you, all living things, and you're going to name them. What does that mean, you're going to name them? You're going to designate their correct place within creation by giving them a name, by differentiating them. And by, the lion becomes the lion, the king of the jungle, whatever you want to say. And each of the beings are given a name that distinguishes it and thereby enables it to find its proper place in God's newly created world. Jacob, in taking his 12 sons and giving each one a unique blessing, which is meant to designate a historic place of operation for each one of those 12 sons, giving each one their importance, each one their moment where they will make all the difference in the world, each one to be aware of their own weaknesses and what they need to avoid in terms of taking a position that rightfully won't work for them. What Jacob was doing is what Adam did. What Adam did at the beginning of the book of Genesis is what Jacob does at the end of the book of Genesis when it comes to us, the Jewish people. He sorts us out. He creates the proper, well-balanced hierarchy, which will enable each and every member of the Jewish people to shine and to be a source of light for the world and to find ultimate personal fulfillment, as well as make a difference in the sum total of impact the Jewish people have in the world. So in a certain sense, the book of Genesis is Sefer HaYoshor. Everything gets organized. Everything finds its proper place. Not so simply, just as we ourselves, when we grow up, when you're a teenager, a lot of different energies pushing a person in different directions. It takes time, experimentation, self-understanding, guidance from parents, guidance from teachers to sort of steer your way through all that, and hopefully emerge as a solid human being, ready to lead when it's appropriate for you to lead, and follow when it's appropriate for you to follow, and to understand that you have a unique, vital, important place in the world, but not at the expense of other people's unique and important places in the world. And when we reach that point, then we can withstand whatever external pressures can possibly be hurled at us, And in fact, those external pressures only give us strength and deepen our commitment to one another and enable us to emerge as a nation which will go all the way through history. And that's the high note and the sense of completion that the book of Bereshit ends. So that when Yosef says, Pokod Bakadi, we will surely be remembered. Yes, he's alluding to words that Moshe is going to say at a critical time in this period of enslavement. But more than anything, he's saying, we have completed a journey. We are now unified and a whole as the Jewish people. And it's just a question of waiting for the moment that God feels is best for us to be redeemed and to emerge from whatever we're going to emerge from, to become the light unto the nations of the world and Hashem's representative through history. And that's the completion and conclusion of the book of Genesis that we reach in this week's Torah reading. Happy to try to answer any questions anyone has. If not, wish everyone a good evening. Stay dry if you're in San Diego. And thank you very much for joining the class. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yes, thank you
Very,
very much.
very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.